Hi there again. This is the second of a series of videos I'm recording for my students at Inter High. The first on Black Americans in 1945 and the aftermath of the Second World War and the discrimination they faced in housing and segregation in the South. You can see, and I recorded that a couple of weeks ago, so it should be easy to find in the video playlist. Here I'm talking about the situation by the 1950s. So the federal government in the late 1940s, as we saw in the previous video, had begun moves towards ending segregation in government offices, particularly in the army. So by 1948, the army was desegregated. Harry Truman, who had all manner of his own bigotries and prejudices towards black Americans, was nonetheless horrified when he learned that veterans of the Second World War, black veterans of the Second World War, were being murdered as they returned home. And this is partly the reason for the desegregation of the army, and partly because there was such a great deal of embarrassment. Segregation was causing a great deal of embarrassment to a country that was claiming that it was the bastion of freedom in the world. By the 1950s, two key battlegrounds emerge in the southern states of America: education and public transport. The segregation of both were areas that black Americans could challenge firstly through the courts. The 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas ruling declared education, segregation in education, unconstitutional. Dwight Eisenhower, the president, had placed Justice Earl Warren, on the Supreme Court as a Supreme Court justice. Earl Warren was a liberal and was minded to take kind of a liberal stances on issues when they emerged, and it meant that he was more likely to be sympathetic towards people challenging segregation. Eisenhower actually, whilst not a segregationist and not a kind of a bigot particularly, but certainly a president that didn't want to get involved in the troubles of the South, found himself cursing the day that he'd ever put Warren on the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court voted to desegregate, or to declare segregation unconstitutional, based upon the self-esteem, the impact of self-esteem to children that segregation causes. So the argument that schools could be separate but equal was a nonsense in the view of the Supreme Court, because anybody who was being told that they could not go to sit next to a white child because of the colour of their skin was going to have their self-worth and their personal development based on that permanently affected. The following year, it sees the beginnings of the Montgomery bus boycott, another area that the NAACP, the civil rights activist organisation, the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, had been looking for some time for a test case. They first identified a black teenager, Claudette Colvin, who had been arrested for sitting in a white area on a bus and not giving up a seat to a white commuter. But she was considered to be, as a sexually active teenager, an unsympathetic figure, and one whose testimony could be pulled apart in court. So instead, when Rosa Parks, an older black seamstress and a long-standing activist in the NAACP, carried out the same protest, all of a sudden the NAACP had its candidate in order to take legal action to challenge segregation. But what also happened in the day after her arrest was the Montgomery Improvement Association was founded, and its spokesman became Reverend Martin Luther King, which was his first kind of introduction to political activism. Okay, so in the next video I'm going to look at the rest of the bus boycott and challenges to education throughout the 1950s, and then we'll look at the developments in the 1960s. Thanks, bye-bye.